I came back without the ability to fear death. Not because I'm brave, not because I'm a man of faith who finally conquered his doubts, but because I watched something on the other side that made death feel like the least terrifying thing in the universe. And the thing that replaced that fear, the thing that lives inside me now, every single morning when I wake up, is so much heavier than anything death ever threatened me with. My name is James Whitfield. I was a pastor for 26 years. I died on a Tuesday afternoon. I was gone for 22 minutes. And what Jesus showed me during those 22 minutes changed everything I thought I knew about the church, about ministry, about the men I had admired from the pulpit. If you're new here, subscribe. What I'm about to share is the kind of testimony that doesn't leave you the same. I don't want you to miss what comes next. And if any part of what I say connects with something you've felt or seen, drop it in the comments. You'd be surprised how many people watching this right now have had their own encounter with something they've never been able to fully explain. Let me tell you how it started. There was no warning. That's the thing nobody tells you about dying. You imagine there's some buildup, some moment where life slows down and you get a chance to prepare yourself. There wasn't. I was sitting at my desk in my church office. It was a Tuesday. I had a board meeting at 3. I had a sermon to finish. I had a phone call I still needed to return to one of our deacons. Normal things, small things. And then I was somewhere else entirely. They told me later it was a cardiac event. My secretary found me slumped over my desk. The paramedics worked on me for the better part of half an hour. 22 minutes of clinical death. That's not something a doctor says casually. 22 minutes without a heartbeat, without oxygen reaching the brain, and then, against what anyone in that room expected, a pulse came back. But I need to tell you what happened during those 22 minutes, because those 22 minutes are why I'm sitting here talking to you right now instead of returning to the pulpit like nothing happened. The moment I left my body, I wasn't afraid. I want you to understand that. I am a pastor. I have stood at more bedsides than I can count. I have held the hands of the dying and told them not to be afraid. But I had never actually believed, deep in the place where the real truth lives, that I was ready for what comes after. I thought I was. I wasn't. But the moment I crossed over, and I'm telling you, crossing over is the only word that fits, the fear just evaporated. Not because it was peaceful, not at first, but because what I encountered was so real, so absolutely solid and present, that everything I had ever worried about on earth shrank to nothing. You don't fear losing your car keys when you're standing in front of eternity. I found myself in the presence of Jesus. I know how that sounds. I have heard NDE testimonies my entire adult life. I have been skeptical of most of them. I am telling you that there is nothing in my vocabulary adequate to describe what being in his presence actually felt like. It was not warm and soft and glowing the way you imagine from the paintings. It was authoritative, heavy, like standing in a room with someone who knows every single thing you have ever done and ever thought, and they are looking at you with complete clarity, and there is nowhere to go. He didn't speak to me first. He showed me something. And this is where I have to ask you to stay with me. Because what he showed me is the reason this testimony has been the hardest thing I've ever had to carry. The first thing he showed me was a place. I understood immediately, without being told, that what I was looking at was hell. Not the cartoon version. Not fire and pitchforks and theatrical torment. I'm talking about a real place with real geography and real people in real agony. The sound of it alone, I cannot describe the sound. It wasn't screaming exactly. It was something beneath screaming. It was the sound of people who had been crying out for so long that the sound itself had become part of them, like breathing. And then he showed me who was there. I recognized them. That's the part that broke me. I recognized them. These were not anonymous faces. These were men whose books I had read, men whose conferences I had attended, men I had quoted from my own pulpit, men whose voices had shaped my theology, whose ministries I had held up as examples to my congregation. Famous men, men with millions of followers, men who had built empires in the name of the gospel. I won't say their names. I made that decision the moment I came back and I haven't changed it. Not because I'm protecting them, they're beyond protection now, but because the moment I start naming names, the conversation becomes about them. And that is not what Jesus showed me this for. He showed me why they were there. This is the second revelation, and this one is harder than the first. These men were not in hell because they didn't believe in Jesus. They were in hell because they had used Jesus. There is a difference, and it is the most important difference in the universe. They had stood in pulpits and spoken his name. They had performed the language of faith with precision and power. They had built audiences and built buildings and built brands on the back of a gospel they had quietly hollowed out from the inside. And the people who followed them, millions of people, had followed a version of Jesus that had been shaped, edited, and packaged to serve the ministry instead of the soul. Jesus showed me the specific moment for each of them, the precise turning point, the place where the decision was made, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of small ones. A compromise here, a rationalization there, a truth softened to keep the donors happy, a prophecy manufactured because the crowd needed something to believe in, a scandal buried because the platform was more important than the accountability. Each compromise was small, each one felt justifiable at the time, and each one built on the one before it until the man standing in the pulpit on Sunday morning was a performance of a person who had once genuinely loved God. I stood there watching this, and I felt something I did not expect to feel. I felt recognition. Not because I had done the same things, but because I could see from where I was standing exactly how someone gets there, step by step, decision by decision. The path into that kind of corruption doesn't look like corruption from the inside. It looks like pragmatism. It looks like wisdom. It looks like growth. And Jesus looked at me, and this is where I have to tell you what he said because he spoke directly to me, and the words have not left me for a single day since I came back. He said, "You know the way this begins." Not a question, a statement. He said it the way a doctor says something to a patient who already knows the diagnosis, but hasn't said it out loud yet. You know the way this begins. I did know. That's the truth I've had to sit with. I knew exactly the way it begins because I had felt the beginning of it myself. The slight adjustment to the message when the biggest donor is in the room. The sermon topic avoided because of who's sitting in the front row. The prayer that sounds like prayer but is actually performance. I knew the beginning of it. I had never followed it all the way, but I knew the path. He showed me what it costs. Not just for the men in hell, for the people they left behind. The congregation members who built their entire faith on a version of the gospel that couldn't hold weight. The ones who walked away from Christianity when the pastor fell, because their faith was in the man and not in Christ. The families who gave money they didn't have to ministries that used it to protect reputations instead of reach people. The spiritual orphans. The ones disillusioned. The ones who now believe that all of it, every bit of it, was theater. That cost. That ripple. That is what he showed me. And it went out further than I could see. One compromised minister. Millions of lives touched by the distortion of what they were given. The harvest corrupted at the root. I want to pause here because I need to tell you something about what it's like to watch that. To be standing in a place of absolute truth, outside of time, outside of the noise of the world, and to watch the full arc of a human life from its beginning to its end. You see things you cannot unsee. You understand connections between choices and consequences that are completely invisible when you're living them. A sermon delivered with a slight tilt. Not a lie exactly, just a lean toward what the audience wants to hear. And then you watch that lean become a habit, and the habit become a posture, and the posture become the man. And the man goes to his congregation every Sunday and speaks with complete sincerity because he has been who he became for so long that he no longer remembers there was ever another version. That is not hypocrisy in the conventional sense. It is something more frightening than hypocrisy. It is the erasure of the original thing. I watched one man in particular whose story hit me harder than the others. He had started with nothing, a small church in a small town. He had genuine fire in those early years. I could see it. The way you can see a flame in a dark room, you can see when something is real. People came to his church and their lives changed. Not because of his charisma, though he had that too, because there was truth there, and truth does its own work. And then the church grew, and then came the book deal, and then the conference circuit, and then the television appearance. and then the need to maintain the machine that had grown up around the original flame. And I watched that flame get smaller and smaller as more and more resources went toward keeping the institution alive. Until the day came when the institution was everything, and the flame was barely a memory. And this man who had once preached truth that cost him something, now preached comfort that cost his congregation nothing, and took their money and their loyalty and their faith and spent it on the machine. He genuinely believed he was still doing God's work. That was the hardest part to watch. He was not cynical. He had simply drifted so far from the original that he could no longer see the distance. Then he showed me the third thing. He showed me the harvest that was possible. And this is the part where something in me broke open in a completely different direction. I had spent 26 years in ministry. I knew what I thought ministry looked like. I had a good church, good attendance, good programs, people whose lives had genuinely changed. I believed in the work. But what he showed me was something I had no frame of reference for. He showed me what it looks like when the real gospel, undiluted, unperformed, unshaped by market forces and donor relationships and brand considerations, what it looks like when that reaches people. The transformation is not gradual. It is not a program. It is not a conference. It is not a book deal. He said, and these are the exact words, "The harvest is still waiting, and most of the laborers are tending to their own fields." I understood that. I understood it the way you understand something when you've just seen the contrast between what is and what could be. Most of the men and women in ministry are not in hell. They are not corrupt. They are not building empires on hollow gospels. But we are, too focused on maintaining what we have built to go into the fields that haven't been touched. We are managing existing congregations when the people who have never once sat in a church are out there waiting and nobody is going to them because going to them doesn't build a platform. He told me he was sending me back. Not because I was special, that was very clear. Not because I had done something exceptional that earned a second chance, but because what I had just seen was a message, and a message needs a mouth. He said, "Tell them what you saw. Don't soften it. Don't make it comfortable. Tell them exactly what you saw." That was the mission, and I accepted it the moment he said it because there was no version of me that could have said no. You cannot stand in that presence and choose comfort over truth. It's not possible. I came back to my body with a shock that I still feel in my chest when I think about it. The paramedics, the fluorescent light of my office, someone's hands on my sternum, the sound of my own voice making a noise I didn't recognize, and then, slowly, the ceiling, and someone saying my name, and the weight of a physical body that suddenly felt like a costume I'd forgotten I was wearing. The first thing I asked for was a pen. I'm not exaggerating. I made my paramedic laugh later when I told him that. He said in 16 years he'd never had someone ask for a pen before asking for water. But I was terrified I would forget. Terrified that the clarity I had on the other side would blur the longer I was back in the noise of this world. So I asked for a pen, and I wrote down everything I could before the doctors arrived. It took me 8 months to speak publicly about what I saw. 8 months of processing, of praying, of talking with trusted people in my life, of sitting with the weight of what it means to testify to something this specific. Because I knew from the moment I came back that this testimony would cost me. You don't come back from something like this and walk back into a normal ministry career as if nothing happened. I was right about that. The response has been exactly what I expected. Some people received it immediately. Something in them recognized the truth of it before I even finished speaking. Others have been angry. And I understand the anger. Nobody wants to hear that men they respected and admired are in hell. Nobody wants to examine their own faith for the places where performance has replaced substance. It's uncomfortable. It's supposed to be uncomfortable. But here's the thing I have to say directly to you, because the voice the Lord gave me is not a gentle voice, and He told me not to soften it. If you are sitting in a church right now where the truth is being shaped to serve the organization instead of serving your soul, you will feel it. You already feel it. There's something in you that knows the difference between a word that cost the speaker something and a word that was carefully constructed not to cost anyone anything. You know the difference between a pastor who is afraid to offend and a pastor who is afraid to fail the people God gave him. You know it. The question is what you do with what you know. And if you are in ministry, if you are the one with the microphone, I need you to hear what I heard standing in that place, watching those men, recognizing the path they took, because I could see its beginning in myself. The compromises feel small. That's the trap. They feel like wisdom. They feel like protecting the ministry. But the ministry doesn't need protection. The ministry needs truth. And the day you start editing truth to protect what you've built is the day the building starts to hollow out from the inside. Here is what waiting costs. I know this now because I saw it from the other side. Every day a person lives inside a distorted gospel is a day they are building their house on something that will not hold. When the storm comes, and the storm always comes, what collapses is not just their faith in a minister. What collapses is their faith in anything they can't see. And I watched, from where I was standing, the wreckage of that collapse, and it went out further than any of us can imagine from this side. The harvest is waiting. Those are not my words. I am quoting directly what I was told. The harvest is waiting, and the laborers are tending their own fields. And somewhere right now there is a person who has never stepped inside a church, who has a question they've never been able to ask, who is more open to truth than any congregation member because they have nothing invested in maintaining their current belief system. And nobody is going to them, because going to them doesn't grow a platform. I came back from 22 minutes of death with one job. Tell what I saw. Don't soften it. I'm doing that. Whether you receive it or reject it, I've done what I was asked to do. If this testimony touched something real in you, if it confirms something you already knew or opens something you've been avoiding, leave a comment. I read every single one. And not because I want the engagement, because I know from what I saw that you are not alone in whatever you're sitting with right now, and I want you to know that. Subscribe if you haven't already. The other testimonies I've shared here carry the same weight as this one. There is more to say, and I'll keep saying it for as long as I have a voice to say it. The harvest is waiting. Don't let what happened to those men happen to you. Not because of the fire, because of what you were created to do before you were ever afraid of being uncomfortable. That's what I came back to say, and I will keep saying it until my last breath on this earth, which I now know beyond any shadow of doubt is not the end of anything that matters.